It's my great pleasure to host this conversation today on the political lives of South Asian Americans. One of our featured speakers is Dr. Sangay Mishra, who is the author of this wonderful book called Desis Divided, The Political Lives of South Asian Americans. And in it, he does extensive research on political participation of South Asian immigrant communities and looking at kind of the intersection of political incorporation, transnationalism, and racial and ethnic politics. And it's a fascinating read because I've never seen a book like this that encompasses the entire South Asian American community in such great depth and coverage. Usually there's always one community that is more dominant or featured, and so this is truly a trailblazing research that I recommend everyone to read. And we are joined today also by Dr. Jim Whitty, who is a professor in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at George Mason University. He is also a member of the APF Board of Directors and does extensive field work in Pakistan with in the education sector and with various universities. I should also add that Dr. Mishra is an associate professor of political science at Drew University. And so the way that we'll do our conversation today is we'll go to Dr. Mishra first for a presentation of the book, and then I will ask Dr. Whitty to serve as a discussant, and he'll provide comments. And then I'll also engage both of them in a conversation and bring in some of the work that APF has done on civic engagement and community empowerment. There's a lot of interesting overlap in the research that Dr. Mishra has done in the burgeoning research that APF is doing on civic engagement. So this conversation today is directly connected to kind of our future research agenda as well on civic engagement. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Mishra. Welcome.
Thank you, Shamaira, and thank you, Jim, for agreeing to comment. I'll just share my screen in a moment. Can you see my PowerPoint? Yes, okay. Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here, and thank you for the generous words about my book. I'm going to talk a little bit about the arguments that I have made in my book. The book was published in 2016 and feels like it was, it's moons away, right? It feels like a lot of time has passed and a lot of things have developed. So, but I want to go back to the book and talk about some of the main arguments that I made. But I want to start by giving you a brief snapshot of a data point about South Asian Americans, where they are. So when we think about South Asian Americans today, and I think about South Asian Americans in the context of larger Asian American politics, South Asian Americans have become one of the most important group among the larger category of Asian Americans, and they are the fastest growing group among Asian Americans. So if we look at this data point, between 2000 and 2018, the rate of growth has been tremendous, 137% for Indian Americans, 159% for Pakistanis, and 217% for Bangladeshis, right? So these communities have been growing. Another point which I want to underline is that if you compare Indian, Pakistani, and Bangladeshis, then you can clearly see that if you look at people who are naturalized, who are citizens, then we see that Pakistani Americans are much more integrated in terms of naturalization. There is a higher level of naturalization among Pakistanis, and that speaks to the larger pattern of immigration that we see among South Asian communities, particularly Indian Americans, who are basically somehow stuck in the green card waiting line, and that has created all kinds of problems, right? And so I want to talk about some of the arguments that I have made in my book. And in my work, I look at South Asian American political incorporation or inclusion. That is the way in which they become a part of the American political process. The term political incorporation has been traditionally used to study the process of inclusion of minority communities. It is defined in the following way. I'll just quickly give you the definition. Uh, Political incorporation is a process through which new groups begin to participate in politics and eventually achieve representation and influence in government. South Asian Americans are a part of the successive wave of migrant and minority groups that have struggled for greater inclusion in the US political process. There is a substantive body of scholarship that has looked at the mobilization and incorporation pattern of different communities. Talking about that scholarship, there are two models that the scholarship is largely built around. The first model is known as pluralist or assimilationist model, which is based on the early European immigrant experience, Italian, Irish, German. It underscores the relative openness of the political process and predicts a bumpy but complete inclusion of contemporary non-white immigrants in mainstream political institutions. So it's much more optimistic. Ethnic mobilization is a major part of this model, at least in initial phases, mobilizing as Italian and Irish, early 20th century, or even before that, are examples of this. This literature grew out of a larger corpus of work that has been broadly categorized under the rubric of immigrant assimilation. In contrast, the minority group model or racialization model underscores the barriers to political inclusion faced by African Americans as the classic case of obstacle to minority incorporation. The model predicts that new non-white immigrants will also reproduce the experiences of African American political incorporation, which include partial, halting, and incomplete inclusion and a reliance on race-based mobilization. These two models thus have completely contrasting prediction about the extent and pace of inclusion of contemporary non-white immigrants. But I'm not interested in figuring out which model South Asian Americans follow. So my interest is much more in underlining that if you look at these models, then what you see is that there is a centrality of unified ethno-racial mobilization that happens in both the models, right? And so what I am interested in figuring out is whether South Asians are mobilizing around their ethnic identity, whether Indian Americans, Pakistanis, and Bangladeshis are mobilizing around their ethnic identity. To what extent are they mobilized around their ethnic identity? To what extent are they unified? And when I look at South Asian experience, I argue in my book that political incorporation and inclusion of South Asian communities in the US is deeply tied to internal group distinctions. Furthermore, the precise nature of ethno-racial mobilization or ethnic mobilization could be better explained by foregrounding these important cleavages, distinctions within the group. So when we look at these cleavages, these could be religion, class, nation of origin, caste, gender, sexuality. And I argue that when we look at South Asian experience, it suggests that the notion of unified mobilization, whether it's Indian, Pakistani, Bangladeshi, or broader South Asian, is complicated by internal cleavages within these communities. And furthermore, a unified ethno-racial mobilization is not a precondition for political representation and some influence. So political representation can happen without ethnic mobilization. And that is what I am suggesting in my book. And so to make this argument in my book, I'm presenting today two illustrations from my book. And one of them looks at post 9/11 period and what happened in post 9/11 period. And the other one looks at political representation, electoral arena. So first I'll start with political representation. So when we look at post 9/11 period, then it was clear that religious identities not only became an important axis for racialization, of South Asians, but they also shaped the mobilization against racialization. The evidence that I collected suggests that in reaction to 9/11 attacks, there was a lumping of all South Asians alongside Arab Americans on the basis of their appearance as outsiders, suspicious, and threatening. There were attacks on South Asians all across the nation. The racial lumping of South Asians points towards the elasticity of the racial construction of those appearing to be Muslim. And I want to put that under quote, appearing to be Muslim in the post 9/11 period. You do not have to be Muslim to appear Muslim. Muslim looking emerged as a racial category. So the impact of racial hostility on South Asian communities was reflected in interviews that I conducted with Indians, Pakistanis, and Bangladeshis around 2006 and 7 in LA and New York City. And I'll present a couple of quotes here from my interview. So this is somebody from Gujarat, a Hindu Gujarati based in LA, and he's talking about his experience. And he is saying, well, when they look at us, they always think that we are from somewhere else because of our skin color. Maybe they think that we are all terrorists or something. I don't know. They try to connect us to those people. That is 9/11 attackers. Another quote that I use here is by a young Pakistani Muslim from Brooklyn, and he's talking about his experience, and he says there was a genuine suspicion of Muslims and defensiveness on the part of Muslims. Just makes you walk around the streets much more carefully. I have learned to be much more defensive in public situations. Certain people get angry, not everyone. I just mean have a defensive, self-protective demeanor. Scholars have argued that when groups get racialized, it might link to some kind of pan-ethnic solidarity. They argue that external threats lead to intensification of group cohesion as members react in defensive solidarities and develop common interests where none may have existed. According to this framework, a distinct possibility of solidarity-based pan-ethnic mobilization response, the possibility of that existed among South Asian Americans. So the comparison you can make is the Vincent Chen moment in 1982 when Vincent Chen, who was of Chinese origin, was killed thinking that he was Japanese. And in reaction to that, there was a solidarity among Asian Americans. But my own research says that we did not see that happening among South Asian Americans, right? And there is a fracture among South Asian Americans, and that fracture is much more along the lines of religious identity. And I just want to point to a quick quote to just illustrate that point, right? That I asked one of the Indian American leaders that, is there a possibility of coming together against racism? And he said that, and I'll read the quote, Hindus must be supporting Sikhs on that sort of campaign, but I don't see any way that Pakistanis, Indians, and Bangladeshis can meet. Religion is a big divide. It really is. It is not only a feeling, but it is there in practical life. Also, even in India, I think Hindus do not trust Muslims. Whether Muslims would go for India or for Pakistan, the statement points to the fault lines within South Asian American community. And I do not need to belabor this point because by now it has also become kind of a common sense understanding of the situation, right? And so to conclude this section, I would say that what we are seeing in post 9/11 period is distinct mobilization happening along religious line, and community coming together was something that could have happened, but that did not happen. And I want to briefly think about Pakistani experience here, right? Because it's distinct. Pakistanis being an overwhelming Muslim community, the option of distancing from the targeted Muslim identity was not available to them. The targeted religious identity, being Muslim, became even more salient for them. A lot of my Pakistani American interviewees talked about how for younger Pakistani Americans, their Muslim identity became prominent, perhaps for the first time. In fact, and this is what they were talking about, in fact, many of them particularly younger Pakistani Americans, many of them did not think about religious side of their identity that much earlier. And so they became aware of that. And so it has been a very, very challenging period for, particularly for Pakistani, Bangladeshi, larger Muslim community. However, on the positive side, I would say that the political engagement in the US particularly became more important for the community, and investment in Muslim civil rights organizations became highly important. The 9/11 experience has generated tremendous level of political engagement among Pakistani Americans and Muslims, and that has happened also among South Asians in general, whether they are Hindu, Muslims, or Christian, right? So from here, I want to move on to my second example, which is to do with political representation, right? And so when we look at political arena, one of the things that I want to underline is that the structure of electoral system is such that there are very few electoral districts which major South Asian presence, right? And so when we look at data on South Asian political representation, it suggests a unique trend, right? And the unique trend is that of a growing cases of South Asians contesting and in some cases succeeding from areas and electoral districts which are primarily white majority districts as non-ethnic candidates and running a very de-racialized campaign which could appeal to white electorates. I did an analysis only of Indian American candidates, but it applies to Pakistanis and Bangladeshis, also particularly to Pakistanis. When I did the analysis, it suggested that a large number of Indian American candidates contested and succeeded from areas which were white majority. Most of these electoral districts were white majority, and I'll give 2-3 examples. I had a table which I am not sharing because in the interest of time. So for instance, when you think about Vin Gopal, who is a senator in New Jersey from 11th legislative district, which is Monmouth County, that district has 76% white population. Similarly, everyone knows about Pramila Jayapal. Her district in Washington state is also 76% white. Another Indian American member of Congress, Ami Bera, wins from a district in California, which is 66% white. I want to qualify here that we are also witnessing attempts in area where there is a relatively higher level of South Asian and Asian American concentration. So think about Northern California, New York City, parts of New Jersey, Houston, Atlanta suburb, right? So there is more of traditional ethnic mobilization that is happening, but trend of white representation is something that is quite huge and important, right? But why is this important to highlight for my research? It is important because it provides an insight into the electoral mobilization of the community. It is distinct from the traditional mode of minority representation that is dependent on mobilization of one's own racial or ethnic group. For instance, in case of significant number of Black and Latino candidates, mobilizing their co-ethnics is important because they are contesting from districts with large numbers of voters from these communities. Most Indian Americans or South Asian American candidates are not reaching out for votes to their co-ethnics, and in most cases, they are appealing to an overwhelming white electorate, or in some cases to multiracial electorate. This trend of representation does little to bring co-ethnics into the political process in terms of naturalizing, registering, and voting. One of the fundamental assumptions of the dominant models of political incorporation that I talked about earlier is that in the process of seeking representation, particularly electoral representation, ethnic and racial groups mobilize their co-ethnics, and it leads to greater naturalization, greater registration. But this process we don't see playing out in case of South Asian Americans. There's one kind of co-ethnic mobilization that we observed among South Asian Americans, and that is that when anytime a Pakistani or Indian is contesting from any district in the US, they reach out to the co-ethnic for money, right? So they want to mobilize money, and that's when they reach out to their co-ethnic. But that reach out is also to a very small segment of the community, and I would call it a very small elite segment of the community, right? And so you get a sense of the kind of mobilization which is happening in electoral arena, right? The picture is a little bit mixed now because the character of the community is changing, but what I argue in the book, I think, holds still true. My next example, how much time do I have?
Please go ahead. We're okay on time.
Okay. So the next example that I want to talk about is the importance of South Asian Americans in presidential election, not because of their numbers, but because they are people who become very, very important in fundraising, right? And so anyone who follows electoral politics, particularly at national level, knows that there are people called bundlers, right? And they bundle money, and so something in the range of 500,000, 100,000, right? In millions, right? And so you see that kind of thing happening, right? And so I looked at 2012 data, 2012 Obama election for my book, and I found that out of 769 bundlers, there were 27 out of 769 were South Asians, right? And which is a huge number, right? Given the size of the community, right? And so you can see all the names are not there, but they're Indians, they are Pakistanis, and many of them are business people, many of them they come from the world of politics, but they gather people together, they raise money, and then they are able to exert a level of influence that comes from this kind of clout related to fundraising, right? And so in my book, I argue that it is clear from this kind of involvement that South Asians in fundraising, they're disproportionately represented in this kind of world of fundraising, right? And through this process of bundling contribution, a very small section of the community manages to garner political influence with important political institutions. So on the right side, you can see that the kind of appointments that they get because of the contributions that they have done, right? And so this points to a very distinct path of political clout and inclusion for wealthy and well-connected South Asian that is mostly disconnected from the larger community. As a result, a very narrow and elite segment is able to gain clout without thinking of ways to connect with and mobilize the larger community. So the argument that I make is that, okay, they gain influence, they get connected to higher echelon of power structures, but it doesn't do much for the community, or at least it does minimal for the community in bringing them into the political process, right? And so in a way, all these examples are kind of attempt to show how a unified ethnic mobilization in case of South Asian Americans is very, very limited, right? And so the idea of sort of unifying the community around ethnic identity is something that we are not seeing, right? And so we have to think about a different way of conceptualizing, thinking about the community. But and this has happened post book, right? So there is one example where I would say that I have started noticing a trend of community coming together, right? And that is a trend which is becoming stronger and stronger. And I'll end by talking about that trend, right? That what we are seeing is a possible point of convergence among South Asian Americans, right? So whether they are Indian Americans, Pakistanis, Bangladeshi, Sri Lankans, right? What we are seeing is that if you think about Asian American community in general, then what we are seeing is that South Asian Americans are the most on the most liberal side of the divide, right? So they are most democratic voting, And even on policy questions, they are on the most liberal side of the divide. So they are shaping Asian American politics in important way, right? And so South Asian Americans are most democratic voting among all Asian American groups. And so now in the last 3-4 election cycles, we have good data that people have collected. And so I just want to share a couple of data sets. The table is very small. 2016 presidential election, that was one of the rare elections when they polled Pakistanis and Bangladeshis also. Typically, they don't poll them because if they have less money, smaller groups are the one who fall off, right? And so what you see in this chart is that Bangladeshis, Pakistanis, Indians are overwhelmingly democratic voting, right? And this is a post-election survey, right? And so you can clearly see that they are leading and they are unified on the question of their support for Democratic Party. Then when we come to 2020 elections, again, you don't see data on Bangladeshis and Pakistanis. This is a pre-election survey, right? And so there are a lot of people who are fair amount of people who are undecided, right? So in this table also, you can clearly see that Indian Americans are the most democratic voting among all Asian American groups. So what I'm trying to suggest through this last part of my analysis that even though there is a lack of ethnic mobilization, there are internal cleavages within the communities that are important to look at. But when it comes to voting, because of all kinds of reasons that I can get into in Q&A, they have tended to be more democratic, right? And that's an important point to remember. And that's the complexity of the community, right? And so the whole divide between Indians, Pakistanis, and Bangladeshis somehow disappears when it comes to this moment, right? And so that's an important point to keep in mind. And so I'll just conclude that in conclusion, I want to suggest that there are internal contestation within South Asian community, and the idea of unified mobilization is faced with many challenges that need to be acknowledged. I talked about internal contestation through the politics that unfolded in post-9/11 period. There were deep cleavages produced by religious identity and other kinds of cleavages, right? And then I talked about electoral system. I would not repeat that. One thing that I did not talk about, and I will finish with that, in my book, I refer to class and occupational distinctions within the community that is producing a rich variety of organizations and organizing that demands us to look at internal cleavages. This is particularly relevant for Pakistani American community, since class divide is an important feature of most Asian American groups, but particularly pronounced in case of South Asians and Pakistani Americans. Folks working at gas stations, grocery stores, cab industry, construction, and other kinds of low-income jobs encounter very different kind of civic and political spaces in comparison to high-income and upper middle-class segments of the community. I don't think I have done enough work in my book on this question, but when we think about working with any of the South Asian communities or thinking about civic engagement, political mobilization, we have to keep this distinct reality in mind, right? That there are distinct ethnic mobilization that are happening within the community, and those distinctions could be along the lines of class, along the lines of occupation, or along the lines of religion, etc., that I talked about. So with that, I want to stop, and I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you very much. And I'll stop sharing. We can't hear you.
Sorry, I always make fun of my mom for doing that, and now I did it. So
too bad. Sorry, she's not on the webinar.
She's not on the webinar, no. So lots of rich content to unpack here, and I see that our audience has already started submitting questions, so please continue to do that. I want to turn to Jim to offer some reactions to what was shared first.
Good,
Please.
happy to do it. And thank you for the opportunity, Shamila, and getting me to read the book. I bought it the day after you showed it to me. But I think, it's, first of all, it's a very well-written, well-organized book. And the attention to detail is very impressive. I particularly like the historical part. And, Sangay, as you said, the problem with the book is it immediately becomes old. You collect your data and then you have different things happening and it almost becomes a mini history, but that does not negate the value. And I think particularly for the historical lead up and introduction and the qualitative pieces, the interviews that really sort of capture the voice, some of the quantitative data, the problem there is there's very little specifically on South Asians. And that's one thing that Shamila and I can talk about at some point soon, is getting some more up-to-date data, because I think it is important. But I think, the overall theme of the fractured nature of the South Asian diaspora, that comes through very well. And I think it's very, very important. And it's what a lot of people don't recognize, and particularly people who have not had much interaction with the diaspora community. And I'll say, my primary, I think I've made a dozen trips to Pakistan in the last, well, pre-pandemic, so last 7 or 8 years before the pandemic. But with the community here, my interaction has come primarily through 2 organizations, APF being one of them, and the US-Pakistan International Chamber of Commerce, which is the second. And I'm on the board of directors of both, and they're completely different. The way the makeup, the the people who are organizing it, but also involved in it, that APF sort of grew out of a very professional group of immigrants, and has expanded, that they're increasing. And I really enjoy that Shamila has been working on bringing more artists into the organization at different levels. But it really is very well established Pakistani immigrants to the US. USPICC primarily represents small and medium-sized businesses. Some of the people that Sangay was talking about at the conclusion of his discussion. And there you see completely, you have a lot of gas station owners who've done very well for themselves. You have people who are cab drivers, small shops in the US. And so they're very different types of organizations. And I think that's also part of the mobilization problem, is it's not just across national origins, but also even within the groups that you find, say, from Pakistan, from India, from Bangladesh. And so I think that's an important consideration. I would say a little bit about the two models that you introduced, the sort of pluralist and the racialized model of integration, that I like to think of those more, and my background is in sociology. And one of the main sociologists, that was sort of one of our founding fathers, is Max Weber. And there he thinks about ideal types and sort of pure categories of any type of social process. And so this types of integration, whether it's pluralist or the racialized version, if you think about those as ideal types, abstractions that you can use as analytical levers, and so that they're each a certain migration pattern or process may participate more or less in both types. And I think that's an important consideration to keep in mind. And again, I really like the section on immigration regimes. And that's so important because you call attention to the context, the US internal context, but then also the types of migrants that are coming through, wanting to come through at a particular time. And so if you want to dispel for emotion, I mean, take the emotion away from the wall, but think about restrictions on migration and immigration, that they're differently porous for different groups. And the groups where the free flowing is happening changes over time, often based on US political goals and objectives. So I think that really comes across very nicely in that part of the book. And so rather than kind of repeat all of the good points you make, Sangay, I've got about 4 or 5, we'll see how much time I have, sort of questions that might get the conversation started. The first one is you talk a lot about the tech sector, which is important, particularly for the Indian diaspora, but is becoming more important for the Pakistanis as a new tech sector there is emerging. But I think there's another piece of technology that we should be considering. And that's the extent to which technology can lead to technical enclaves. You know, we have long, in the history of migration, immigration, there's long been attention paid to ethnic enclaves. And those are thought of in geospatial terms. But with technology, there is the possibility, and this is, you talk a little bit about this with transnationalism, of maintaining that enclave across space and between nations. And that has, you know, as Alejandro Portes talks about sort of the dual nature of social capital that you can get in an enclave. It can be very empowering, but it also can be very limiting. You know, that some of the work we did, we looked at surveys of immigrant professionals from all different countries in the United States. And we asked them, how much social capital did you have? We didn't say social capital. We said, how many friends and family that you could rely on for support when you arrived in the country? And then we asked also about how much social capital did they have at that moment? And not surprisingly, and we were trying to understand economic success, the people with high levels of social capital today were more economically successful. But the really interesting part was the people who had high levels of social capital when they arrived in the US were less likely to be successful. And that's, again, they found a sort of comfort zone that didn't force them out into the mainstream, where and again, we used a very sort of, and we caught some flack when we presented this to different immigrant communities. It was a very Western notion of success, and it was on your own personal success and not necessarily all that you do for your family and friends. But if you look at it in that lens, there is some limitations that come with social capital. So I'd like to sort of hear some of your thoughts about kind of a technical enclave and how that could be happening with the diaspora. A second thing that is important, I think, is, you know, again, as a sociologist, I was thinking also about, you know, the title of your book, Desis Divided. When we look to culture, are there any signs of daisy fused? That somehow there is a fusion of South Asian culture, whether it's in the arts or food, literature, film, and, you know, how you, to what extent do you see that? Another question that I had, and this was, I was kind of, as I said, I'm kind of a numbers guy. So as I was sort of making some notes yesterday, I went to our favorite source, the American Community Survey, which you use some of their data as well, Sangay. And you know, they have data on where you were born, okay, which is often how people identify that first generation of people from different South Asian or from different countries, period. And then they also have self-reported ethnicity or national origin. And so what I did is I sliced the data a little bit, and I looked at the Pakistanis and pulled out the people who were born in Pakistan, and then cross-tabulated that with their ethnicity. And what I found was 68, 69% of Pakistanis born in Pakistan self-identified as Pakistani. Of course, there were some who, about 7%, who said they were Indian, which makes sense. Another 8% said they were Asian, and another 12.5 refused to provide the information. And that's an interesting thing when you compare it to the Indians. Okay, because I did the same process with people who were born in India and what's their self-reported ethnicity. And for the Indians, it's 83% self-identify as Indian. And, there's a handful who consider themselves Pakistani. Only 3% said Asian, and about 6% didn't report. So it appears from that, just a quick analysis, that there's a much stronger sense of sort of ethnic identity among the Indian diaspora. And so maybe some of your thoughts on that and how that connects with the work you're doing. And maybe if I have time for one more broad question, and then I know Shamila would like to jump in. And this gets to sort of the division between the different groups in Pakistan that I've gotten to know. And I want you to imagine a scene. And this is on Pakistan Independence Day in Manassas at Bull Run Park. And about 5,000 or 6,000 Pakistani Americans there. And guess who the star speaker was? Terry McAuliffe. And Terry McAuliffe is up on the stage. He's dancing with the leadership of this Pakistani American group. And I think that, and this may be something that's emerging now, that's a little bit different as a mechanism. You talk about the importance of fundraising, but I think there's also some important friend raising going on. And that's particularly in this group that may not have the funds to influence the politicians, but what they do have are the personal networks where they can get people out and show support and give a candidate, in this case, Terry McAuliffe, a chance to try to win over their votes. So I think I'll stop there and get Shamila's insights and then a more open discussion. But again, thank you, Sangay, for the book. It really was a great read.
Thank you so much, Jim, for that very thoughtful analysis and feedback. Sanjay, why don't you go ahead? If there's any aspect of what Jim added or asked, is there anything you'd like to respond to?
Lots of great ideas to think about. I don't think I have. I'm thinking through all these questions, right? And I think the point about tech sector and tech sector becoming an enclave, right? And so when we think about ethnic enclaves, we generally think about spatially fixed, right? So we think about Chinatown, we think about Koreatown, right? But this concept of ethnic enclave is very, very different, right? And I can see that that operating, particularly I follow a little bit more on Indian side than on Pakistani side, but I can clearly see how people are going back and forth, right? They're constantly going back and forth, they're constantly interacting, and that creates a network, a resource that people dip into, right? Now I'm not as sure about the assertion or the argument that that this leads to complacency or this leads to them not doing as well, right? And so that part I'm not as sure about. I can see in a common sense way, I can see that if you come to the US and if you have already existing network, then you might tend to get more comfortable, but that might also give you a leg up, right? And so I want to know a little bit more about that. I want to understand that, and if there is any literature on that, I would like to see a little bit more the dynamics. But it's a very, very interesting proposition that
and I think it really is an empirical question.
Yeah,
where it could go either way, and again, data would be needed to see how the impact of this technology plays out.
Absolutely. On the question of Desi, Desi Divided is much more, it's, my argument was less about cultural divisions. It was much more about how do people organize, how do people mobilize, how do people think about their political agency, right? And when people are thinking about their community, their political agency, I see much more divide, but when it comes to cultural sphere, there are all kinds of ways in which people see fusion, right? And and that fusion is sometimes threatening, right? Because you do not want to be. I mean, the whole dynamics in the post 9/11 period was that that sort of getting wrapped into that fusion, right? That if you are brown, you are Muslim looking, right? And so there was this whole thing about bindis, right? That Indian consulate in New York, I think, right after 9/11, somebody in the Indian consulate gave this statement that we have to make sure that Indian women, when they go out, they are wearing bindi, right, with this dot on the forehead, right? I'm sure everyone in this room knows about that, right? And so this idea that that people would know out on the street what a bindi is, and they would be able to make that distinction is preposterous, I think. But that also, what I'm trying to say is that that fusion is there, right? That mixing is there, right? And so that mixing can be sort of welcome, adopted, but that mixing is also threatening, right? And so that fusion is a very, very complex thing which communities are working through, right? And so fusion is a reality, and there is no denial to that. And I think my book doesn't emphasize on that, but definitely strong sense of ethnic identity among Indians. I don't know. I mean, I'm looking at the comments, and somebody responded to your remark that maybe Pakistani is such a fraught category in this country. Some people might be hesitant to do that. That sounds like a reasonable explanation. But broadly speaking, I would say that when we think about sort of our South Asians thinking in terms of Asian American identity, are they thinking themselves or as Asian Americans? And the answer is that across the board, no, they are not thinking of themselves as Asian Americans in comparison to even among Chinese or Koreans, who are quintessential how Asian is conceptualized in the US. Even among them, there is a tendency to think more along the lines of Korean and Chinese, but there is also an acceptance of Asian American identity. But we don't see that much among South Asians. So that is a commonality, but the dynamics among Pakistanis, I think, is something that is to explore. And I'm thinking about the comment, and I'm thinking about your remark. Yeah. So yeah.
And I think with the. I'll just say one quick thing. I also think 9/11 has something to do with it. And there again, going to the data, 9/11 is now 20 years ago. Mm-hmm. And so thinking about the youngest cohort of people that we have data for, and kind of running that same table and seeing, among young people, is there this difference in self-identification between Indians and Pakistanis?
So in some research that APF has conducted this year on civic engagement, a lot of these issues came up, and we inquired further. So first we ran a survey, very simple survey, trying to measure just levels of engagement in political and civic life. Things like, have you ever attended a fundraiser, or how often do you vote? Are you registered? Are you a citizen? Some basic questions about behavior to observe some trends. But in that, we also asked about how you identify. And this survey is not yet public yet, because we're also doing a series of focus group conversations to get more in depth. But what we found on the question of South Asian identity is, when we asked, do you identify as South Asian American or Asian American, or which of these categories, including Pakistani American, we did observe a generational divide. So if you were under the age of 35, you were more likely to associate with the South Asian American identifier, in addition to Asian American and likely Pakistani American, but that decreased the older the respondent got. That was interesting to us. In terms of our engagement as an organization, as a foundation, we've anecdotally observed the same dynamic. So in a non-quantitative manner. So that has kind of been, we see that, we observe that in our own experiences. The other observation, again, this is more anecdotal, is that in the course of doing this research, our own research fellows and volunteers in the research have come across research that suggests that Asian Americans who are not South Asian don't really view South Asians as part of this Asian American category, even though there are South Asians that do, right? And so there's some kind of connectivity and affinity that's coming from the South Asian side towards the Asian American side, but not the other way around. And I'm curious how much of that is related to this like lumping of kind of certain groups for political purposes, right? We have the AAPI community, which when it comes to voting does try very hard to include South Asian Americans in that, right? And so if you're someone in the South Asian community looking for a pathway to get involved and to mobilize, like AAPI is one of those quote unquote ethnic routes, right? And so that's something we definitely want to explore further, because also I believe the majority of the Pakistani American community is quite young. And that's, I think that we can look into the survey data to confirm that. And I'd love to see that data, Jim, that you pulled on kind of how people identify to measure it against ours. The other thing I wanted to add about kind of models of more community examples of other communities that have made it. We, again, anecdotally as an organization, I've observed that a lot of leaders in our community are looking towards the Jewish community as an example of good mobilization, and linking kind of the domestic politics with foreign policy interests and building impact and kind of growing their representation. So, which is really interesting just on its own, given the kind of tensions in the Muslim world around Israel. So it's, to me, it's kind of inspiring to see that there is some kind of nascent bridge building or aspirational, at least, in trying to learn from from a very different community, frankly. And then of course, like the Indian American community's example of bundling and influence is something that is constantly referred to. Now, the question I wanted to pose, Sanjay, is one about the political cleavages, and people have also kind of alluded to this in the Q&As. So do political trends in South Asia, like the political cleavages from back home, do they affect voting behavior, voting trends amongst South Asian Americans? What did you observe in the course of doing your research? In parts of the book, you do talk about the importance for South Asian Americans to give back to the homeland and be thankful and appreciative of what they've been given, even as they succeed in America. I think these are good questions to like explore, like how does this manifest in political life?
Mm-hmm. No, that's an important question, and that's also a complex question. So my answer would be that particularly first generation immigrants, they are deeply connected to what's happening in the home country, right? And they are deeply influenced by that. Large number of people, when you do survey, when you ask questions like how often do you read newspaper, do you contribute to a political party, and things like that, what you see is that the day-to-day level of interest declines dramatically as people settle in this country, right? And so there is a way in which as time passes, people create some distance between country of origin and what's happening here. So that's a secular dynamics that's happening all across all immigrant groups, right? But then there are political trends that are important, right? And so I can talk about one example that that a lot of people are familiar with, right? That Hindu right in India, BJP and Hindu right in India. We know that Narendra Modi made it a point to show his closeness to Trump. He did events that showed that he basically ended up endorsing Trump for his re-election, right? And so we see that in within Indian American community, but what we see in elections is that people, so there was Hindu right wing was at least section of Hindu right wing was pushing uh, against Democrats, right? And they were supporting Trump. But what we are seeing is that that did not impact the pattern of voting of Indian Americans in the US. So even Hindu right wing, a large section of them ended up voting Democratic because of the way in which their position in the US, right? So in the US, they are a religious minority, right? They are brown, right? And when they're looking at two parties, then one party is completely sort of pushing this idea of white racial resentment, right? One party is pushing this idea of Christian evangelical domination in politics, right? And so even for Hindu right wing, it was too much to digest, right? And so my own sense is that yes, what's happening back home impacts politics in all kinds of ways, but the way US politics is poised today doesn't feel like that's going to have a large impact. If it was UK, I would say it would be a little bit different. Communities are much more not evenly divided, but there is a more divide between conservative and labor in the case of UK, right? And so I would say that yes, it impacts, but it's complicated, and it doesn't translate into Narendra Modi signaling that I support Trump. It would not translate into even people who are with Hindu right, who are sympathetic to him, translating their vote to that. We don't see that.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. There's another way that I've been looking at it, which is the governments, so the Indian and Pakistani governments are pretty active in doing this. And I think they're following the model of maybe China and Israel, where they have a significant diaspora overseas and they want to harness kind of the economic strength of that diaspora. And so India and Pakistan have undertaken deliberate kind of campaigns to attract the diaspora back in country, right? Whether that means coming back for jobs or just simple investments, right, into the formal economy. But all of that to say that the governments do view diaspora as a political tool. And, you may not want the government, but the government wants you, kind of thing, right? And so I've observed that again, this may be generational. I'd love to know if this came up in the course of your research. If you're first generation and it's more likely that you may be more connected to, say, there's a local chapter of a Pakistani political party in Houston. You might be more likely to get involved in that. But then that compels you to also get more involved in American politics in the representation of your home country, right? And that first generation dynamic, I think, has overwhelmed second generation members of the community, because then they also are put into this representation category, or there's this expectation. And that I worry about how that filters into the American political system. Does that box people in? Does it ghettoize us essentially into only being representatives of these ethnic communities, which are still tied to back home? And I don't think this is a deliberate intention of the governments involved. I think the governments involved are looking for economic prospects for connecting the communities to back home. So I would just love to get your thoughts on that. I mean, this is a bigger conversation. I feel like there's more research we could do on this. But as we have a larger second generation, in particular in the Pakistani American community, it is a cleavage that doesn't get acknowledged even.
I think, and Sangay, you bring this up in the book, this notion that brain drain has increasingly been replaced by brain circulation. And so you've got people coming to the US, getting an education, going back to India, perhaps starting a business, or going back to Pakistan, starting a business, and then coming back to the US, where they have built ties and have social capital through their educational experience. And I think this is one of the things that is so important is with the educational system, which is one of our greatest assets, I feel. It's one of the few places we have a positive balance of trade, or at least we did until a certain administration came along. But that it's a $39 billion net industry is our education system. And the infrastructure is one thing that we have, and one thing that brings the talent from overseas, including India, Pakistan, China. And then in some ways, it's good they go back because it's good for the countries they came from, but then also the potential for increased trade and business development through the established connections that they made while they were getting their education in the United States. And I think that's something we really have to not let fall off. And we had the Trump administration, and then we had a pandemic, and that put a real damper on international education. But I hope it comes back, and there are signs that it is. Particularly with new student enrollment, which is so important.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's an important part of what we are seeing in case of Indians, and in case of Pakistanis also large number of international students. And that has a domino effect, right? That keeps going for a considerable period of time, whether they stay here or go back. On the question of governments trying to sort of think about diaspora in ways that is instrumental, right? And I would say that, I mean, there is a lot of cynicism that we see among political parties, right? And so it's not only about come and invest, right? So that was a phase, right? That was a phase when people talked about buy this bond, right? India is in a monetary crisis. We don't have dollars, right? Buy this bond, take us out of this situation, right? Think about 1980s, 90s, that time period, right? But we don't see that as much. The economic equation is, because of liberalization, the economic situation is much more changed, right? And so what I see now is much more cynical attempts, and I'm kind of blinded by only limited examples, right? And so in Indian politics, and I'm sure in Pakistani politics also, and in Bangladeshi politics, diaspora has become a very important platform to fashion your politics, right? That if you can demonstrate that you are popular in the US among Indian Americans, right? And people are rooting for you, right? You are making a claim that people who have really made it, people who are the cream of our society, they approve of me as a political figure, right? And so that aspect of diaspora has become much more important. So we didn't see Manmohan Singh or Narasimha Rao or all these people coming and doing large rallies, right? But that dynamics has completely changed, right? And so when there is a rally by Indian Prime Minister in the US, a large rally, he is primarily thinking about Indian politics. He's thinking about an election in Bihar or UP or Gujarat, right? It's that cynical, right? And so there is a way in which it has taken a very, very different form, right? And so that's really worrying, and that is hard to wrap one's head around. But I would also say that there's a lot of noise that gets created, right? So there is a distance between the actual community and the groups which are hyperactive in these formations, right? And that distance has to be probed, right? And so we construct this notion that everyone is equally invested in that kind of politics, right? But research shows that people have established a fair amount of distance from home country in terms of their day-to-day living, right? And so that distance is also playing a role, right? And so we have to investigate, right, that much of what we see is a lot of heat and dust, but actual reality is a little bit different, right? Actual community is a little bit more distant from what's happening, right? But people who are active, who are vocal, they can create a lot of trouble for community in general. I'll say one thing about second generation, true for Indians as well as Pakistanis, that second generation is a low information group, right? I'm saying low information, not in the context of American politics, but in the context of Pakistan or India. They have low information about what's happening in India or Pakistan, right? And they are always very natural, that they are always very hesitant to stake a claim on anything vis-a-vis India or Pakistan, right? And so that low information dynamics, right? And I'm not saying low information in a negative sense, but that's the dynamics of second generation, right? That they're very distant from the dynamics of what's happening in home country, right? And so that can lead to, so I'm thinking about, people must have read about the recent conference that was organized against Hindu right in the US, right? And that became very controversial, right? And so I can see that a very sort of second generation that does not have too much information about dynamics in India can be sold a particular kind of Hinduism or Hindutva politics in a particular way, right? But they would also be at the same time very, very hesitant to get involved in that, right? And so I'm not very sure how to read it, right? Yeah. That are they going to get sucked into this, or are they going to create a distance, right? And that dynamics is really interesting and worth exploring.
I know Shamail is going to jump in here.
Did you want to say something first?
No. I have an idea what you're going to say. So
there's so much. I'm like struggling which point to pick up on. So I think with the second generation, there is that natural space, as you suggest. And then there's a deliberate, like, I want space because I don't connect, or maybe I want to, but I don't know how. One thing I didn't mention is in our research, the unpublished research, is that there's also this, like, you talk about racialization, and I feel like there's been this like further racialization post 9/11, like a self-racialization of identifying as South Asian Americans, identifying more with the Black community and the civil rights community, other communities of color in the United States, and a very deliberate alignment and association through the participation, through participation in protests or expression of ideas on social media. And a lot of the typical analysis is like, oh, well, this is like post 9/11, like you're in this like Muslim looking category or you're not. And I think a lot of communities of color kind of have these modes of protest and coming together that second generation aspire to. And so there's been some interesting like overlap there. And I find it even more interesting because growing up in a South Asian American community and experiencing like quite a bit of racism towards Black Americans and Latinos, and knowing that that's there, and maybe knowing that a lot of my peers and people younger than me didn't grow up in households that were so exposed to the civil rights movement. So this is fascinating if you think about it in terms of prospects of like for American politics and voters, and thinking about even if we lean Democratic, what are we going to lean like left? Are we going to lean center now? And then you have to think just about basic demographics and age numbers, right? And so I think that that is also another space that could be researched further. And it's important to us as a foundation because our mission is building bridges, right? And so it just doesn't mean that we're talking about US and Pakistan. We're talking about maybe building alliances with the African American community so that we can learn more from them. And so there's this like self-racialization idea that comes into mind, but would love either of your thoughts on kind of any of those ideas.
I have sort of a tangentially related, and it gets at voting. And in Sanjay's book, when you talk about the Indian Americans who get elected to office being in predominantly white districts or white jurisdictions, and you said, yeah, you haven't had a chance to do that yet for Pakistan. And I think that would be really interesting because could it be that the identification of Indians as a model minority, as people who are particularly competent, particularly well engaged, that's the reason they're saying, okay, they're brown, but I'm going to vote for them because they're smart. And then you've got the Pakistani who I think the general American has many other different types of stereotypes based on religion. And to see, how well do Pakistani candidates fare in white districts? And, particularly if you look at the state and local level, you may have enough elections to look at where you can really begin to control for another variable or two, education level, time in country, and those sorts of things. But I think that would really be a good way to judge how the voter assesses South Asians who are aspiring to leadership roles.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that point that there is a way in which, so in my book, when I was writing the book, when I was researching for my book, 2009, 10, 11, it was very different conversation, right? So people would refer to, when I would say that I'm working on South Asians, looking at Indians, Pakistanis, Bangladeshis, they would invoke Bobby Jindal. Nobody invokes Bobby Jindal now, right? But that was the model, right? That's how Indians have succeeded in politics, right? That you go to a deep red conservative state and you produce a politics and you become successful, right? And
or Nikki Haley, for that matter.
Nikki Haley. So those were two figures, right? But now the conversation has changed completely, right? And so it's very different. In New Jersey, for example, I did a lot of interviews in New Jersey, and at least I found one example where small town New Jersey, there was a Pakistani mayor, and I was interviewing him in 2007-8, and he did talk about how he was able to persuade the communities to think about his credentials, right? That he had this whole experience in this sector, and he can deliver things to the town, right? And so we see those examples, but more and more, particularly post-Trump or even before that, Islam and Muslim identity has become fraught, right? And so that is going to create a problem. But that's something to explore. But I do feel that Indians have a relatively easier time penetrating some of these networks, right? To Shamaila's point, that's very, very interesting. And my next project, if I'm able to teach less, my next project is going to be, I'm trying to work on, specifically focused on second generation, right? Second generation South Asians, trying to understand, particularly in the arena of politics. And I've been doing some work with my students, and a couple of things came up, right? And so they interviewed some of their friends, and they would ask them, my students are South Asians, they would ask them, what is it that you get involved in? And they would say things like environment, right? I want to be involved in a movement which thinks about the question of environment, right? They want to get involved in questions around sexuality, gender equality, right? And so there is a way in which second generation's political canvas looks very, very different, right? And so even as South Asians, they want to be involved in things like conversation around policing, right? Conversations around civil rights, right? And so there is that, which is very, very interesting. And there is one work which has come out. There is a political psychologist in political science department, I'm forgetting his name, at UCLA, who has come out with a book, I think from Cambridge, where he talks about emergence of this category of people of color, right? That is that category important, right? And he's particularly looking at second generation Asians, Latinos, immigrants, and he is saying that when we think about politics, they are unifying around the category of people of color. And what does it mean? It means that they're thinking about many of the questions that Shamaila, you were raising, right? And so I think there is a way in which a different kind of political sensibility is emerging within second generation, which is very, very interesting, right? And so they are not necessarily too much focused on Asian American or South Asian identity, but they want to think broader, right? And they want to engage with that broader framing, which is very different from how we conceptualize politics when we think about think in terms of first generation, because first generation is much more about representation, right? You see that shift happening within second generation. This is all very tentative, but that's how my mind would be working at this point.
And I'm reminded of my own conversations, as part of, being in communities of color and having that kind of conversation on issues and identifying with folks that are, have very different backgrounds than you, but some kind of shared experience. It requires you to be honest also about your place in this hierarchy, right? This political and social hierarchy. So I've had conversations with my Black friends who are like, what are you talking about? Your family came here legally. You came from, they're more privileged than most. We're college educated. You might have lighter skin. You're not treated the way Black people are. And so we also have to confront these kind of privileges and these benefits that we get because of the bias in society. And then it becomes more complicated kind of conversation to have, right? Because I don't think a lot of us are prepared to have those difficult conversations. But I agree with you, it's the direction that we're headed, many of us in this second generation category. One really important question I have to ask you, Sanjay, is you showed these two charts of how Asian Americans voted. One was from the 2016 and one was from 2020. So in 2016, Pakistani and Bangladeshi Americans were included, and in 2020 they weren't. So how do you get included? How do you make the cut? Because I think that's we struggle with finding the data, of course, but then it's also politicians or staffers are looking at this data, and if we're not even on the list, then we're invisible, right?
No, I mean, it's really unfortunate, and it's really it's all about money, right? And so these surveys are conducted by, and so politicians are not going to run surveys on. So they are more interested in median voters, right? And median voter is not a Pakistani or an Indian, right? So politicians, political Democratic Party, less likely, I think. Maybe things are changing a little bit. These surveys are conducted by academics like us, right? And so people who, my mentors, people I work very closely with, they are the people who are involved in this. I don't do surveys. I'm, as you gather from my book, I'm more qualitative oriented, but I know that data is really, really important. So I really look for good data. So people who conduct these surveys are, so I don't know if anyone knows Karthik Ramakrishnan, who is at University of California, Riverside. I don't know if anyone knows Janelle Wong, who is University of Maryland, Asian American Studies Center, right? And so these are people who conduct surveys, right? And so they're always looking for money, right? And so they're applying for funds and they're getting money, and at least since 2012, I would say that this group, I mean, the group nature of group always changes. Jane Jung, who is at USC, she sometimes get involved. So there are a bunch of people who are quantitative oriented, they do this work. And so they have, so when they don't have money, they drop off smaller groups, right? And so so what they have been doing is that they have been conducting surveys on 6 major groups. So Indian, Chinese, Japanese, Vietnamese, Filipino, and Korean, right? These are 6 major groups that they have been conducting surveys on. So you get most data on them, right? When they have money, then they would include Pakistanis and Bangladeshis, right? And so I would say that's the time when, if you have access to resources and if you can pull some money towards that group and ask them that sample Bangladeshis, sample Pakistanis, right? Because it's important that we get data. They are interested. So I talk to Janelle, I talk to Karthik, and tell them that this is not good because South Asian American politics is anyway dominated by Indian Americans, right? And if we don't have data on Pakistani Americans, then it's even bigger problem, right? And so that's a resource problem. Little bit of sensitivity also, right? So I would say that if there was a Pakistani American on that group of scholars, he or she would push a little bit more for inclusion, right? But it's more for resources, knowing those people and pushing when it comes to that moment, pushing for that, right? 2016, they did that. There are surveys on Muslims, right? And so you can get a sense of how Muslims are voting, but that doesn't give you a sense of how Pakistanis are. You don't get data on that, right? So it's really unfortunate. Whenever I get a chance, I try to push for this, but those are the people to look for, right?
All right. Well,
you're searching for a needle in the haystack in terms of your sampling approach. And I will say just a little bit quickly about the sort of move, as you're talking about the second generation, both of you, and the issues they're interested in. I think that's not just a immigrant or South Asian shift in interest. There is this broader cohort and generational change where the framework is much more human rights oriented rather than civil rights. And I think that's what we're seeing playing out in the diaspora community, but then also in the broader US community.
Fascinating. Well, I think on the question of data and funding, I think Sanjay just gave us our next project, Jim. I think.
All right. Well, we've got to find the money, but
yeah, we'll find the money. But that's it informs so much of what else we're trying to do. So, for example, encouraging people to get out the vote. We had a Get Out the Vote initiative the last presidential election. It felt good to do it, and we figured out kind of the right messaging and the modes of delivering the messages, but then we didn't really have a good sense of like how our community was voting. There's kind of sporadic data, and so it's mostly based on kind of anecdotal or emotional or experiential kind of knowledge. And there's even more basic things that we lack, which are comprehensive voter lists. Right? There's no one organization that focuses on the Pakistani American community that looks at who is registered to vote, how many Pakistani Americans are there actually in each state that vote Democrat, that vote Republican, et cetera. And like you said, Sanjay, there are Muslim organizations that do this, but they don't categorize along these lines. And so it becomes kind of a guessing game, which is also gets into tricky questions of identity, self-identification.
I would just quickly add that the recent survey that Devesh Kapoor, Milan Vaishnav, they did, they had funding and they did a very comprehensive survey on Indian Americans only. A lot of good data, right? And so I always wonder that can we do this on Pakistanis and Bangladeshis, and that would really provide a trove of data, right? And so there are ways in which academia is tilted in certain ways towards certain groups, right? And so we are working with that, right? And so I would encourage everyone to take a look at that data, right? That the kind of questions that they're asking to first generation, second generation about country politics back home, right? And so a lot of good data, which is very different from the kind of data that we get from the surveys that Janelle and Karthik do, because they are more focused on politics in the US, right? So those are good models, but we need people, resources, money, motivation, and complete laser focus on that.
Absolutely. So we'll continue that conversation offline for sure. We just have a few minutes. I want to wrap up by reading a small excerpt from the book, which really spoke to me, and it connects kind of the first generation, the second, and maybe third, and kind of all Americans who've gone through the immigrant experience. There's this, and it's early in the book on page 21, where Sanjay, you write about kind of South Asian Americans and immigration regimes, and you do a really good job of rooting the South Asian community in kind of American history, which people, a lot of us are not raised, if we're South Asian American, to think that way, right? We have to go search this out and connect the dots. You've connected them for us really well here. And you have a vignette about a town in Northern California called Willows. So let me read this for everyone's edification. One of the earliest Muslim communities with distinct Pakistani roots was established in Willows, in Northern California. Fazil Muhammad Khan, a Punjabi immigrant who came to the United States in the 1920s and became a successful farmer and entrepreneur, helped establish a mosque in the area and was instrumental in nurturing a thriving Muslim community that later identified itself as Pakistani. All right, so this, I didn't know this little piece of history, and it's like I've been searching for it my whole life, because obviously it makes sense that Punjabis who came from India, from what became Pakistan, were coming and working the railroads or elsewhere. But to contextualize this way is really important, because it offers in some ways a starting point for anyone coming from Pakistan, and it reminds us that histories don't start with political births of countries. They go well before that, and they're much more nuanced and rooted in things like heritage and faith and not just political narratives. So I found this to be a particularly poignant part of the book, and it was at the beginning of the book, so it spoke to me. So I want to thank you, Sanjay, for all the wonderful work you've done to empower our communities with your knowledge and your research, and to Jim as well, who is a steadfast kind of supporter of immigration research and of APF, and to the wonderful guests with all your dynamic questions. We will be sharing this online on our website and on social media, so please do share when you see it. All right. So thank you, everyone. Stay safe and healthy.